A Croft in the Hills by Katharine Stewart.
Chapter 6. Kaylee's. 2 days after Christmas, the day of the little children's party we had planned, the ram died. He had been ailing for a week or so, and we had done our best in the way of dowsing, but to no purpose. As I looked up from the sandwich cutting at the kitchen window, I saw Billy making his way slowly up through the rushes in the lower field, carrying the bedraggled hulk of the once majestic creature on his shoulders. It was a sad moment, but luckily we hadn't time to brood. Jimmy and Billy performed the brief funeral rites while I brought out the jellies and cream. 8 youngsters from the 3 neighboring crofts arrived at dusk. Their faces gleamed with cleanliness and anticipation, and we had a very lively party indeed, Billy joining in with a surprising gusto. The children taught us their own enchanting singing games, which have ever since become our favorites. The wind and the wind and the wind blows high, and we are all maidens, and in and out the dusty bluebells, and many others with sweet nostalgic cadences. Party making is easy when you have unlimited quantity of eggs and cream, one of the little self-sown conifers, which need thinning anyways, for a tree, and a handful of unspoilt youngsters eager for enjoyment. Each year, we have a small gathering of children in the house at Christmas. Soon after Halloween, we start planning it, and long after it's over, it's still a subject of chuckling reminiscence. The smallest social occasions have a savor to it here. Some neighbors we may only see twice or at most 3 times in a year. They live perhaps only a mile or so away, but in the summer they're busy with the crops, and in the winter, snow or storm may prevent them venturing far at night. So when we do meet, it's a small celebration in itself. First comes the firm handshake as we congratulate each other tactily on the fact that we are still in the land of the living. Then come the comments on the state of the weather and on the condition of crops and beasts, leading to the climax of the interview, the exchanging of any real tidbits of news, the spicier the better. Finally, over a cup of tea or a dram, if it is a really special occasion, a mellow reminiscence mood settles on the company. This is when Jim and I hold our breath and wait for the old stories to come out for an airing in the fireside glow. We hear of an old bachelor who lived in the remains of a once model Croft house and would tether his cows to the foot of his bed to keep them from straying at night. Of Mary, who had the second sight and could see on a winter's evening's walk the funeral procession of those who were soon to die. Of the old widow who had the evil eye and could bring about the death of a favored beast or wish ill luck on a whole family. These were all men and women who had lived hard lives, had been a law unto themselves, and had left their legend lurking among the tumbled stones which had been home to them. We never passed one of these pathetic ruins, but we visualized the children scampering down the doorways. Many of them died young, as the headstones in the burial ground testify. But most of those who survived left their mark in other parts, in Canada and New Zealand. The depression in agriculture after the First World War was the immediate cause of many of these upland holdings being abandoned, but probably it would have come about in any case. With the improvements in communication, the standard of life was changing. The community was no longer isolated. The young people could get to town at the cost of a 2-mile walk to the bus, instead of having to wait for the odd occasion when they would go on foot or on the steamer on Loch Ness. Once in town, they would fall under the spell of the shop window. A small holding could not stand the strain of providing cash for bought commodities. When the old diet of milk, meal, potatoes, eggs, and a barrel of salt herring carted from the West was no longer considered adequate, holdings had to be enlarged or other means of subsistence found. Whether the children are healthier now, with the addition of tea and wrapped bread and sweetstuffs to their menu, is perhaps a moot point. Certainly, preventative and remedial health measures saved them from the epidemics which carried off many youngsters in the old days. These epidemics, when they did occur, hit them exceptionally hard, reared as they were in isolation from germs and so lacking natural immunity. Labor-saving devices do spare the women and the men a lot of killing drudgery, but How far the real quality of human health and happiness has been improved would be difficult to say. To look at the serene faces and hardy frames of some of the older generation is to make one doubtful of using the word improve at all. One neighbor it is always a special delight to meet is a grandmother of close on 80 who lives now alone in her Croft house. She has reared a large family and has known every kind of trouble and grief. Yet there is always a smile on her face to challenge the wrinkles, and she thinks nothing of walking miles straight across country, fording burns and climbing fences to visit relatives of a younger generation who may be sick. Finley, who guided us in all of our affairs with sheep, on hearing that the ram had died, immediately gave us one of his own on loan till the end of the tupping season. So our fear that some of the ewes might not bear lambs was allayed. The year came to an end with a storm of alarming fury. The scullery window was blown right out. One of the hen houses, mercifully devoid of hens, was scattered in bits across the field, but miraculously the straw stack stood intact. We blessed the day we had battened it down with weighted ropes. After battling with the elements in the kitchen, doing my indoor chores in gumboots and balaclava, I developed a heavy cold, and we spent our hogmanay dozing over a huge fire, myself well drugged with aspirin. New Year started auspiciously for me, with Jim and Helen bringing me tea and toast to bed, and immediately all sneezing and snuffling were at an end. In the afternoon we walked out across the moor in the still glittering cold and came home to a dinner of roast duck. Then the Cayleys began. Since the previous hogmanay, our neighbors had become friends, and a good year's work had established a firm bond among us. We knew our way about. To us there is no place on earth so comforting as a Croft kitchen on a winter night. As you approach the glow of the lighted window, the smell of peat reek comes at you in waft of welcome, pungent and homely. On reaching the threshold, you brush the snow from your boots with a small besom provided for the purpose. Then the door opens and you are bidden with an outstretched hand to come away in. Inside, the flames are licking round the upended peat. There's the hiss of the pressure lamp and the ticking of a huge old clock. The pattern is the same everywhere. It hardly varies, yet it never fails to delight. Where a little company gathered in sheltering walls that huddle against the vastness of the night and of the cold. We're supremely glad to have warmth and calm and relaxation. The men stretch their legs and slowly stuff their pipes. The women move quietly about, placing the kettle, the tea caddy, the cups in strategic positions. The children sit, bright-eyed, on the settee, hoping bedtime will be overlooked. At New Year, it usually is. The kettle is not brought to the boil till the men have had their dram, the women their glass of port, and the children their fruit wine. To wash down the raisin cake and the shortbread. Tongues are loosened at this time of year and throats well moistened. You can almost forget the wireless in the corner by the window, the weekly paper stuffed under the chair cushions, and expect the Cayley to resume its old character. You almost wait for the song and the story to come floating out of the shadowy corners of the room, but of course they don't. The stories are reminiscences, fascinating in themselves and never wearisome. However, often they are repeated. They're founded on fact, and they haven't the wild sweep and gusto of the old imagined tales. The song, too, has died. There is no longer even the cheerful scrape of a fiddle, though here and there a young lad will produce a tune from an accordion box. We spent many evenings at neighboring firesides that New Year. Helen enjoyed them as much as we did, and was indulged with sweets and oranges, and walked home across the moor at midnight without a stumble, scorning to be carried. The days were not arduous, for there was little we could do but feed the horse, the cattle, and the hens, look over the sheep, and split logs for the fire. Jim and Billy did, however, get ahead with the fencing, whenever the weather allowed, and made several gates. I tackled the accumulation of mending and took advantage of the well-banked state of the fire to do some large bakings. On the worst days, when all outdoor work was at a standstill and it was too cold even to work in the barn for more than an hour or two together, we all turned our attention to improving the living arrangements in the house. All through the previous year, we had used only the ground floor rooms for warmth in the winter and for convenience in the summer. Now, however, we began to explore the possibility of the upper regions. I scrubbed out the 2 bedrooms, and the men shouldered the beds and furniture up the narrow stairway. The walls and paintwork were shabby in the extreme, but decorating would have to wait until the better weather came. The rooms were clean, and we installed an oil stove in each, which we would light an hour or so before bedtime each night. Then we made the spare downstairs room into a second sitting room where we could relax, or so we hoped. The living room had felt and linoleum covering over the stone, and we could go in there gum-booted, dogs at our heels, without fear of doing damage. The new sitting room we planned as a sort of inner refuge, snugly carpeted, its walls lined with the books and pictures we had at last extracted from the boxes in the cupboard. Outdoor footgear and dogs were to be strictly prohibited. We foresaw long Sunday afternoons spent in the comfort of this oasis, but actually it didn't turn out that way. Sunday afternoons were usually spent attending to lambing ewes, chasing cattle out of the crops, or catching up on domestic work, and the room itself had often to be converted into sleeping quarters for a benighted contractor. But still, we did enjoy the brief moments in it, and the knowledge that it was there was a satisfaction in itself. We began to feel we had got past the stage of the initial assault and were beginning to dig in for the campaign. It was not a hard winter, and by mid-February the larks were singing. Soon we began to sense the slow tilting of the earth towards the sun, and then a rush of activity broke out. Dung was carted to the fields, the vegetable plot was enlarged and dug, houses were got ready for the new batches of chickens. We got wind of activities on other fronts. The hill road down to Loch Ness side was being widened and resurfaced, the worst of the bends rounded, and a fine new bridge built to replace the rickety one over the burn that cascaded down from Loch Lade. It was said that when this work was completed, the bus company would seriously consider putting on a weekly service to Inverness. There were rumors of various new enterprises starting up in the district. A nursery garden at the foot of the hill where tomatoes were grown in soil heated by electricity generated by local water power was already well established. Now we learnt another incomer was to cultivate the sheltered slopes immediately above this garden for the production of soft fruit. Another was setting up a dairy farm, and yet another was going in for mink. The place was buzzing with reports of the activities of the tomato man, the strawberry man, the mink man, and the dairy man. All these concerns were cited in the comparatively sheltered district overlooking Loch Ness. Each time we passed that way on our journey to town, we would watch goggle-eyed for signs of the progress of these fascinating enterprises. We began to feel, with our adoption of more or less traditional methods, distinctly back numbers. Still, our oats had impressed even the seed merchant the previous autumn, and our ewes were in grand shape. Perhaps there was something to be said for a quiet merging into the landscape. The scheme for the testing of cattle came into operation at this time. We had ours tested and found to our dismay that Daisy and one of the heifers were reactors. Daisy's milk had been declared free of bacilli, and she appeared to be in a radiant health, but she didn't make the grade, so she and the heifer had to be dispatched to the market at once. We brought in a good cross cow, brown with a white star on her forehead, which was christened Hope, in token of our feeling towards her, and a sleek, demure, quite enchanting little cross-short-horn heifer, which we could only call Pet. The name exactly fit her. The buyer had a thorough cleansing and disinfecting and whitewashing before these new beasts were installed in it, and we hoped our little herd could now be established without further skirmishings. A cow, particularly a house cow, is so much a part of the family that one hates to have to exchange her for another. We had just got to know all Daisy's little whims and quirks, knew what blandishments she particularly appreciated, and how to humor her and to cope with her occasional moods. Now we would have to start all over again with Hope. She was to calve in a few weeks' time, and was slow on the move and quite placid. She proved an excellent milker, and we soon came to have a real affection for her. A cow certainly responds to kindness. I soon discovered that Hope would let down her milk most willingly to music. Lily Marlene was her favorite tune. As soon as I began to intone it to a slow, rather melancholy rhythm, I would glance along her back and see her ears twitch, and a dreamy look come into the one eye visible to me. Then the milk would spurt suddenly into the pail, and I knew all was well. The pace of spring was now increasingly rapid. Each evening at dusk we would see the gleam of fires as the heather was burnt to make room for new growth. In the distance we could see the small black specks of figures silhouetted against the glow. With the sticks and switches they were keeping the flames under control. The boys of the neighborhood took a sort of primitive delight in assisting at these firing operations, and it did seem as though the purifying flames were really laying the ghost of winter in the hills. With the approach of lambing season there was another ghost to be laid, that of the threatening, elusive fox. A drive was organized and all guns mobilized. One cold Saturday afternoon, Jim and Billy set off with the others to search the crags and thickets round the Red Rock. They swarmed up precipices and slid down scree, but never a fox did they bag. However, a gesture had been made and some good sport enjoyed. Communal activity always acts as a tonic. The men came home with a gleam in their eye and a chuckle in their throats. But the plowing was easier that year, for Jim and Billy could take turns at it, and all the field work went quite smoothly. But we were coming to a crucial point in our enterprise. Our capital was all laid out in the land and stock, and it would be some time before either could give us a substantial return. Could we hold on and keep the place going till the time arrived? Were we justified in paying Billy a wage, small though it was? As Jim crawled up and down the field on the tractor, as I gathered pailfuls of stones from the garden plot, with Helen making mud pies in her own corner, these questions were nagging away at our minds. Finally, we went to see our man of business in Inverness. He is at all times most helpful and understanding, and a problem shared is usually halfway to being solved. The banker, too, was cooperative. All bankers have a spine-chilling effect on us, but I think the small country-town banker, who in many cases is of farming stock himself, is perhaps the one representative of the order who does come within our understanding. Our particular banker has enjoyed several days shooting grouse and hares over our acres, and looks positively human in rough tweeds with a gun under his arm. Finally, we decided that we could cope with the situation and that Billy could be kept on for a time being at any rate. The pullets were showing a profit, and at this peak time of egg production we could be cleaning eggs till midnight while listening to a radio play. The ducks, too, were laying again. The sun had a warmth to it. Coltsfoot was blazing along the sheltered bank of the burn. The peewits were tossing and flashing over the fields, and the wild geese had gone off, honking their way gaily into the white north sky. It was a time of promise, after all. Hope presented us with a tidy little black bull calf one morning at 7. 2 days later, the first of the lambs was born. Each morning after that, we would look out first thing to see how many new white specks had appeared on the moor overnight. Helen was the quickest at spotting them, and she kept the tally. Each evening we would walk right round the flock, watching for any ewe that needed help, but they were wonderful mothers, and we only lost one lamb. Billy quickly skinned it and draped the small fleecy coat over the body of a lamb which had lost its mother. The bereft ewe, after an astonishing nosing, adopted it as her own. We had some anxious moments, for there are so many creatures ready to make a meal of a newborn lamb: the fox, the buzzard, the killer dog. The weather itself can be cruel. Driving rain is one of the worst enemies, but we were lucky, for the weather, though cold, was mostly dry, and the lambs got safely on their feet and began to thrive. One Sunday in mid-April, when everything was more or less under control, we left Billy in charge and set off for Loch Ness side. The primroses were in flower on the woodland slopes, and the birds were singing their heads off in the leafing trees. The water was blue and glittered in the sunlight. It was a morning out of time, and we'd each had a foot in Eden.